On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, are container imports crashing? Hi, I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. So, this issue has been one that's been ongoing for quite a while. Did a series of videos not too long ago talking about container volumes, container rates, the shifting of containers from the West Coast over to the East Coast. But this topic keeps getting a lot of traction out there and a lot of press. Thought I'd take a moment, break this issue down. Let's talk about it. What are we expecting to see in terms of container volumes coming into the United States, especially at the second half of 2022 into the beginning of 2023? So before we do that, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, let's jump into this topic. So this was a chart that was put out today on Twitter by Craig Fuller, the CEO of FreightWaves. Now, this uses their proprietary system entitled Sonar. And one of the things that they're tracking are inbound ocean TEUs. Let me explain that for a second. So TEUs is the measurement of containers. That's 20-foot equivalent units, although most containers are 40-foot equivalent units, equal to 2 TEUs. But this is inbound ocean, meaning this is the number of containers that are setting sail from China heading to the United States, as you see in this chart. Now, this is an index, meaning that 100 is January of 2019. And you'll see here early into 2022 that the volume was really, really high. 3 times the inbound volume back in January of 2019. It's taking about 60 days for those containers, once they are loaded, to get into the system here in the United States. We are now in terms of U.S. port volume measurement. So this is where we're currently at. And we're expecting to, again, see a big dip and then a spike again. That spike is those last minute shipments that are coming across for the holiday season. And then we dip. And the measurement he's showing now is actually below the January 2019 level. So we're going to dip below, way below pre-COVID levels for the shipment of containers into the United States. So this is a chart I've used before. This comes from the National Retail Federation, from their port tracker. And what we're seeing here is the number of TEUs coming into the United States, retail imports from 2004 to 2022. And one of the things you see on this is number one, the level that we're experiencing right now for 2022 is 26 million containers. So we are actually over last year's import volume. So we're already at it. So yes, we're crashing down in terms of number of imports that are heading in, but look at that level we're at. If you go back to 2019, it is a big level. But again, what we're seeing here is this peak that happened as a result of COVID. Remember, a lot of issues went into this. A lot of freight was stacked on top of previous freight coming in pre-COVID. And so we just had a huge volume of goods coming into the United States. So while we're going down in volume, we're expecting to see reduction in the number of containers coming in, we are already at a record year, largely because of a couple of reasons. So why so much freight in the first half of 2022? So you have a couple of things. Number one, you had and still have the ongoing negotiations between the ILWU, the International Longshore Warehouse Union, versus the Pacific Maritime Association. This is the labor union on the 29 ports on the west coast of the United States, and the Pacific Maritime Association, which is the ports, the terminals, the shipping lines. They're in the process of a contract renegotiation. That contract expired on June 30th. And there was a lot of questions about whether or not we would see a slowdown in the strike, kind of like what we saw back in 2014. To hedge their bet, a lot of shippers front-loaded their cargo. In other words, they sent cargo that would normally come in the third, fourth quarter of 2022. They shipped it in the first and second quarter, the first half of the year. So you're seeing that. Other issues, obviously, AB5, the truck emissions on the West Coast, especially in California. All of that bodes transportation issues with trucks and drayage out of the ports of California and the West Coast. Rail issues. You had the Class 1 railway strike potentially happening. We're seeing renegotiations. We're seeing right now the approval of agreements right now. But again, a lot of issues with railways. And again, it wasn't even just the potential of railway strikes. Remember, we had the looting of Union Pacific trains in the Alameda Corridor. We had massive delays in getting those trains across. And the simple issue is most of the freight that went into LA and Long Beach did not stay in LA and Long Beach. It went across country. And so the decision has been made largely by a lot of shippers and the ocean carriers to sail directly to the east and Gulf Coast of the U.S. Remember, you can do that now because you have the new lane of the Panama Canal opened in 2016, and most importantly, we're getting Neo-Panamax vessels. The size of Neo-Panamax vessels are growing. We saw vessels up to 15,000 TEUs go through the new lane of the Panama Canal. Plus, we have the ultra-large container vessels that are going westward from Asia through the Suez Canal to Europe and then transloading across the Atlantic and coming in. So a lot of freight is moving in different ways than before. So I follow tons of people on LinkedIn, Twitter, you name it, all over the place. But one of the ones I enjoy reading a lot is Jason Miller over in East Lansing, Michigan. He is a supply chain professor, writes these great posts. He's in a little bit of a fight here with some of the shipping firms. Him and Craig Fuller don't see eye to eye. But I enjoyed this post that Jason had because he's taking a look, and what Jason tends to do is go for data. I love data. I'm a data guy. And he does. And he went right into the Census Bureau data. I want to show you a chart that he attached to it. This is it right here. So this first chart here he has is on metric tons of containerized waterborne imports to the West Coast ports from Asia. So before we were looking at TEUs, this is looking at tonnage. And TEUs and tonnage don't always jive exactly right because, again, it depends on what type of cargo is going into the containers. And he took this all the way back to 2018. Again, love professors. They love getting their data. And 2022 is right here. So it is this blue line right here. Let's see if I can get you going. There we go. It's this blue line right here, this very top line. And notice how it is exceeding every other previous year until you hit June, July. Again, that's the labor renegotiation on the ILWU. And then you see it starting its nosedive. Amount of tonnage coming into the West Coast from Asia is dropping. And notice the last month he has here is September. We don't have October data as of yet. Let's go down here to his other chart. Now, the other chart here is the same thing, but this is imports to the East and Gulf coasts from Asia. And what do you see here is, again, is number one, much less than what you see going to the West Coast. Purple line right here, this is 2021. But what you see happen here as the delays start to mount off LA and Long Beach is a little spike here in August, but then come November, a huge, massive uptick as freight shifts over to the East and Gulf coasts. All the way up here in January, there's a big drop in February, which I'm not 100% sure why that happens, but then you still see it upticking so that you're sitting there right now at about 6 million tons of cargo into the East and Gulf Coast. Compare that with less than 5 million, probably about 4,750,000 on the West Coast. So the East and Gulf Coast has eclipsed the West Coast in not just TEUs, but also in tonnage. And remember, it takes a little bit longer for cargo to get to the East and Gulf Coast than it does to the West Coast. So when you see that dip in that chart by Craig Fuller, you have to extend it out just a little bit. That takes us all to this story here by Mike Schuller over on GCaptain. Falling U.S. container imports from China hit West Coast ports in October. So Mike, as always, top-notch reporter for GCaptain, can summarize things better than I ever could. Puts it in here where he talks about the fact that U.S. container imports tumbled again last month compared to a year ago. A decline in Chinese volumes continued to impact West Coast ports, according to new data released by the Canadian technology group Descartes Systems. The company's latest report shows U.S. container imports in October at 2.2 million TEUs, down 13% year over year, but still 7.2% higher than the pre-pandemic year in 2019. Let's go to the Descartes report. September U.S. container import volume drops, but delays at East and Gulf Coast ports remain high. Love Descartes and the reports they do. One of the things I love is, number one, they have these great summaries and they have charts. And you know me, I love some charts and data. Let's look at the summary here real quick. First, September U.S. container ports were significantly lower than traditional volumes, marking the start of peak season wind down. September, we're talking about the fact that we're significantly lower than we are in the past, usually because of the just-in-time nature of logistics. We would see September being a really peak year because because everyone was bringing everything in, which you could do because there was space in the ports, the rail capacity was there, everything was good. But that's changed now. We know that. Second, decline in Chinese import volume significantly impacts share at West Coast ports. Share at major East and Gulf Coast ports rise to almost half of U.S. container imports. So the great problem here that no one knows is what is causing the Chinese import volume to drop. Is it because there's less demand, which everyone is thinking that's what it is, less demand, people aren't spending as much, recession looming on the horizon, uncertainty over a political election. Everybody's just not sure what's going to happen. But at the same time, we know China is locking down ports again, locking down cities because of COVID restrictions. We also know China is very worried about issues internally within them. We've seen their imports go down. We see they're not producing as much. And so this may be an internal Chinese issue that we're not exactly sure about. Third, September port delays remain extended at major East and Gulf Coast ports. I could throw up marine traffic and show you the delays off Savannah, Houston, New York, New Jersey. They're there, especially off Savannah. They are there. And so what we're seeing is a backlog there. Savannah is talking about the fact that they should be able to clear the backlog by November, but I'm not sure. That's kind of iffy right now, I'd tell you. Because again, we're shifting these delays. Cargo is sailing longer distances. But the reason that shippers are doing that is because of the increased reliability. They know they're getting their goods when they want them. They're not hitting the black hole that had been LA and Long Beach for a long time, especially the uncertainty over labor negotiations and railways. I want to show you a couple of charts that they did. You see right here the container import volumes. Go back to that January 2019. This is the baseline that Craig has in his chart. One of the things about January is you see that post-January, everything tends to drop. And right now, 2019, this is the September numbers here, you're still above those September 2019 numbers, still above January 2019 numbers. But this is taking a precipitous fall. But again, pre-August, import volumes were the highest they've ever been. And so that tells me that a lot of freight was front-loaded into the first half of 2022. Next chart here. This shows the difference from month to month, from September to October in the ports. And look who's losing here in the ports. First off, everybody's losing in the ports. Everybody is down in terms of loss in the ports. We're seeing the volume go down. Savannah went down largely because of issues with Hurricane Ian resonating in there. But LA, Long Beach, New York, New Jersey, not so much. Charleston, minor. Houston, minor. Norfolk, not too bad. But you're talking about nearly 20% or over on the West Coast ports, the exception being Seattle right there. Look at the exports out of ports. Again, month-to-month difference, 183,000 container loss coming out of China, Vietnam. You're seeing those. The only places where you're seeing upticks right now is India and Germany. Measuring port volume shifts from May to September of 2021 versus May to September 2022, everything's going to the East and Gulf Coast ports. You see the upticks. Charleston, a slight uptick. Houston, a massive uptick. Norfolk, Savannah, New York, New Jersey, all seeing upticks, while the West Coast is seeing declines. All these measurements give us an indication that the volume of containers coming into the United States is decreasing. I mean, that's pretty clear. Go back to Craig Fuller's sonar data there. We're seeing the number of containers coming out of China going down, reducing down. However, again, got to go back and look at the historical nature. I'm a historian. I can't help but look at the historical data. You look at this, 2020, 2021, and now 2022 were very unusual years for obvious reasons. 21, 22, record freight level we saw. We saw it go through the roof. And this year is going to go through the roof. Now the question is readjustment and rebalancing. This means lots of questions out there for the ocean carriers. What are the ocean carriers and the alliances going to do? We already see what they're doing. They're blank sailing. They're canceling sailings of vessels coming across, meaning they're reducing the capacity to move containers across the ocean. They're slow steaming. They're slowing the vessels down so that vessels are taking longer to get across, spacing them out, but they still need to have regular service. You still need containers coming in on a fairly regular basis, so they're slowing them down. That lowers their operating costs. We know that they're going to have to uptick the number of vessels out there because of IMO 2023 restrictions coming into place, because of emission standards and the requirement to use very low sulfur fuel oil, and a whole variety of new measurements that have to be accounted for by the IMO, the International Maritime Organization. You have people like Soren Skew, the CEO for Maersk, saying that he's going to need 10 to 15% more ships, more capacity than he currently has to do it because of the slow steaming and all the issues associated with this. So we're in a flux position, I have to say. I'm not sure where we're going. We expect to see, the number of ships and container rates drop for good reasons. We're not going to have as much volume coming across at the end of 22, fourth quarter, which we're in now, into the first quarter of 2023. You always, all those charts showed you January, they drop. They drop off the cliff into February. The question is coming out of February into March. That's the question we're going to see, is what happens to those freight rates then? Are we going to see a massive uptick? That's what the tendency is. That's what the norm is. That's what we typically see. So expect to see drops in rates right now. We saw a little bit of an uptick in the chart. I looked at the freight rates recently, but that's like last minute shipping right now. People trying to get some spot rates real quick to get some containers across very quickly to meet the needs of the holiday season. We're talking about Chinese New Year. We're talking about a lot of times that we see a huge decline post-holiday shopping, Black Monday, Black Thursday, all those go by. But when we hit into the second quarter of 23, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. Hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media. Hey, please share it. Send it out there. Whatever method you use for social media, word of mouth, I don't care. Go ahead and get it out there for everybody. And if you can, support the channel. How do you do that? Very simply. Hit that super thanks button down below. You can contribute directly to the channel, or you can head on over to Patreon and become a patron of the page. For my Patreon members out there, I'm going to be hosting either the last day of the month or the first day of the month. I'll be doing a Patreon episode answering your questions. A good buddy of mine, Drac Kinnefeld, who runs a great naval history channel, does this. He has what he calls the Dry Dock, where he answers questions from his Patreons. I need to do that. So if you're a Patreon member, head on over there, leave a comment on the query I have out there. I'll take in all your questions, putting them together, and we'll do an episode addressing those questions. If you're not a Patreon member, get on over. You can do it for as little as $2 a month, and then I can address directly your questions. Until our next video, this is Sal, signing off.